So, the young me, wow. As a kid, I was a tomboy. I was always a competitive athlete. In my teen years, I was in beauty pageants, and I was Miss New York teenager. The Army always attracted me. And then in college, I decided to join Army or ROTC.
Chris is thriving in college. There's only one drawback.
Mount St. Mary was almost, at that time, almost all women.
Just 9 miles south on the banks of the Hudson River is another college. This one, almost all men.
West Point United States Military Academy is the place where serious cadets go to become career or professional officers.
On Halloween night in 1985, Chris and her girlfriends make an impromptu visit.
We went trick-or-treating in the barracks at West Point. You know, we weren't supposed to be there, but here we were, and Jim was the cadet company commander, and I had dressed up as a baby, and so I had a baby bottle and a blanket. Jim was sitting at his desk studying, trying to ignore what was going on around him. You could tell he was so uncomfortable having this group of giggling girls, and they're all dressed up in goofy costumes. I remember going over and just talking to him. I was like, wow, this is really, this guy, you know, this guy really has his stuff together. I made chocolate chip cookies, and Jim made a point of returning the tin to me. And he said, you know, they were the best chocolate chip cookies I ever had. And they say, you know, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I guess that might have been true a little bit, so. We met at the beginning of my junior year, the beginning of his senior year, and by the end of the year, you know, we just both knew that this is somebody we want to spend the rest of our lives with. You know, he was the epitome of duty, honor, country. That's something you want to be around. I mean, that's the kind of person you want to trust and build a life with. Someone that you can trust. His father was a general, and he was stationed in the Pentagon. Lieutenant General James Houston Johnson. They were known sort of as Fort Bragg airborne royalty.
After graduation, Jim continues officers training, while Chris goes to ROTC Airborne School.
At that time, not a lot of women went through airborne school, and I was the only woman in my chalk. At the final graduation jump, he pinned my wings on, and the wings he gave me were the ones his father pinned onto him when he graduated from airborne school. You know, I just thought that that was really special. The day after that, it was a weekend, and I remember him saying, I'm gonna fix us a nice breakfast. The table was set for breakfast, and there was a bouquet of a dozen roses. And he got down on one knee and put the ring on me and asked me to marry him. So it was very romantic and very sweet. We got married on May 17th, 1987. I remember friends saying, I've never seen someone walk down the aisle so confident. Just felt so right.
When they come out of the church, they have the saber bearers who form an arch.
Two people in the front put the sabers down and cross and say, you know, you can only pass with a kiss. So, of course, the bride and groom have to kiss in front of everybody.
Right from the beginning, Chris understood that, you know, Jim would be in command, but Chris would be the commander's wife. Chris embraced that.
Chris puts her own military career on hold, and she and Jim raise 2 children while moving from base to base.
I got involved in the community, you know, learned the skill of being an Army wife, and supported the career.
Army team couples is what we would call them. When they work well together, there's a halo effect.
We were a really awesome team, and they were building him to take on more advanced senior leadership roles.
Truly a great day to be here at Fort Benning, the home of the infantry.
Yeah, we had a happy marriage and happy family. We had a great life.
Jim's career is on the rise, at a time when the U.S. military needs more good leaders.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
He deployed to Afghanistan with the 82nd. They were a rapid deployment force. Jim got promoted to lieutenant colonel during that time. He came home the following year in 2003, was home for about 3 months, but he'd been selected to command a battalion. They were 101st Airborne Division in Iraq.
This will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, and by the application of overwhelming force.
The children and I moved to Fort Campbell, Kentucky by ourselves because he had already left to go to Iraq. And in September 2005, he deployed again as a battalion commander. And I had concerns that he would be burnt out.
After being apart for almost 4 years, Jim finally returns home. It should be a happy reunion, but something's not right. He's cold and distant, even with his own children.
Jim changed during that deployment. Walking back from the soccer field for one of our children's games, he would just divert off and come back and show up 30 minutes later. Nothing I did was pleasing him. Nothing I did was good enough. All of a sudden, he's not initiating sex at all. So this is when the suspicion starts coming up. Something's not right. He's withdrawing from me. Intimacy is on a decline. What is up?
But then they receive the best possible news.
Jim was selected to command the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Italy, probably the most sought-after infantry brigade command in the United States Army.
We were very excited about it because we were all moving to Europe as a family.
In the summer of 2008, the family relocates to an idyllic residence in Vicenza.
We're finally all together in Europe, and it just didn't feel right. He started getting angry, and I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells around him. I'll never forget one day, too, during that time, he just looked at me and said, "Is this all there is?" Here, we'd worked so hard as a team to get to this, and it was hurtful.
By the end of the year, the relationship is even more strained.
Jim was always engaged with our family. We would do silly things like watch American Idol and all vote together, and he just didn't want to do those things. December 2008 was one of the most miserable Christmases I've ever had. Yeah. So many things weren't making sense. He was insistent that we were going to do a New Year's Eve party. I was worn out and thought, let's just enjoy the holidays as a family. We know you're going to deploy again next year. He said, oh, by the way, we're going to have this Iraqi family join us for this New Year's Eve weekend. And they were going to stay in the house with us.
Jim explains that he became acquainted with the Al-Attar family during his 2 tours in Iraq.
And that he said, there are interpreters. You understand that, right?
There's multiple interpreters at every level inside of a brigade operation. They are part of that same close-knit network for whom you would do almost anything.
I found out he's going to drive to the Netherlands and pick up this family 6 hours up, 6 hours back. And he doesn't have a vehicle big enough to fit them. So he's going to take a vehicle, a van, out of the motor pool, the brigade motor pool, a government-owned vehicle. And he's going to use it for personal reasons. That is a huge no-no. You don't do that. He'd never be that kind of guy that would do that. He didn't lie, cheat, or steal. My gut kept saying something was off. And I couldn't put my finger on it.
Jim arrives home with his friends and presents Aladdin Al-Attar, his wife Shrek, and their 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember the father had a heavy mustache. The mother was kind of your frumpy housewife. And her daughter, she had long, dark hair, wore very dark makeup, and she had a young child.
For the first few moments, it seems like this could be a happy New Year's weekend after all. Until Jim does something subtle. Something only Chris, his wife of 20 years, would find shocking.
He scooped down and picked up the 14-month-old, and the child didn't flinch. Jim wasn't somebody that held other people's children, never scooped up a friend's child. It was woman's intuition. And right then and there, I realized that there's something about this family that's just not right. There was something going on here.
Chris is only about to discover the reason for her husband's distance.
In a very, very tiny community locked inside of Italy, there is a patent place of the highest order. There's no secrets.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him.
He's doing way worse. He's self-destructing. And little did I know, it was just the very beginning.
He destroyed his family, destroyed his name. He lost everything.
Colonel Jim Johnson is acting completely out of character at the family's New Year's dinner, especially with his interpreter's 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember not being able to eat. Everything about this is off. They had their own little private corner down on the end of the table. Haveen had a digital camera in her hands, and Jim was messing with it. And it was the same camera I had been given for Christmas. And he had given her one too, exact thing. I really didn't know how to process it. You're just ingesting it and trying to take the next breath. Keep your composure, don't fall apart in front of these people. That night, and I asked him if, he was having an affair with her. And he said, no, her family would kill her or disown her. Not, I don't feel that way about her. And then I asked him, well, have you kissed her? And he said, yes, but not passionately. What the hell does that mean?
That weekend, Jim tells Chris he wants to take the Alatars shopping at the Army PX.
One of my children said, oh, yeah, we had to wait for Haveen to make her grand entrance down the stairs because we were all sitting around just waiting for her. And she was upstairs doing I don't know what. Haveen is gonna get shoes for the baby. And at one point, Jim's like, oh, I'm gonna go over here. You take Haveen up to the register and pay for what she wants. So she's got these shoes. And on the way to the register, she finds a cute little sweater for herself. She picks out shampoo and other things for herself, just loading up on whatever product she's looking for. And I'm like floored. The mother, she would go outside and smoke cigarettes. During that whole weekend, she would go out and smoke a cigarette and leave the butt on the ground. Who does that? I ended up cleaning 12 cigarette butts off the ground when they left.
When Jim makes the overnight trip to take the Alatars back to the Netherlands, Chris is left alone to wonder how much trouble her relationship is in.
But I didn't want to believe that he was having sex with her. I still didn't want to believe it. I went into his office when I opened the top drawer, and I saw a notepad. And he had written 3 columns: divorce now, divorce in 6 months, divorce a year from now. And he had plotted out which would be most advantageous to him. I just remember when I found that note, feeling like the blood had drained from my face. That weekend I not only cooked, but I remember running a load of laundry for them. I did. My husband's mistress's laundry. Jim got home and I said, I found a note in your desk today. And I said, are you divorcing me? And he looked at me shocked. He said, well, I'm sorry you saw that. No. And then he said, well, is that what you want? I said, no, I don't want a divorce. I want us to work things out.
When you have an affair in the military, if it's discovered, it normally doesn't turn out well for you in your career, which is why there's always denial, which is why you double down on denial.
Jim denies the affair, but Chris remains dubious.
I knew that the child, Haveen's daughter, could not have been Jim's. He had a vasectomy in June 2000. I think she was born in like November 2007. It's not his child. I kept looking. And I don't know if I was still trying to look for something to prove myself wrong or just prove myself right. Well, I finally did. He has a black book, and in the back, he had all these secret email accounts. And that opened up, at that point, 3 years of emails that he had been communicating with Haveen. And some of them were so juvenile. Like, reading them were embarrassing. It was like he was a teenager, a horny teenager, literally. One of the emails she wrote to him was like, "I'm your little shaitan." It means devil in Arabic. That, yeah, I mean, you're a little shaitan, we make trouble all your life, kissy kissy. As the emails progressed between them, I started realizing certain things he was saying with her that corresponded with events in our life, like him taking money out of one of our personal accounts. He had taken $10,000 and converted it to euro and gave it to her. My legs started shaking. I couldn't stop it. And I thought, screw this, I'm calling him. Woke him up and screamed in the phone, "Are you her?" He can't deny he's having an affair. And of course he said, "You're recording this call. Someone's listening in." He wouldn't answer the question. It then led to me insisting that we go to counseling to see the family life chaplain in Vicenza, because I was not about to give up. I was not going to throw the towel in. I thought, I'm going to fight for my marriage. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of adultery in the Army. Chaplains are there to help preserve marriages. The chaplain gave us this book, and the book was about adultery. I don't even remember the name of the book. I hated it. It just made me so angry. One page said, "The person having the affair, it's not your fault." And he just grasped onto that. Like, look, it's not all my fault. It's your fault too that I'm doing this. You know, it allowed Jim to give himself permission to continue to blame me for his actions, which is insane.
If you're a psychologist, this is standard transference. It's transference of blame to somebody else so that you can feel good about yourself, and you build this case, and you actually begin to believe it.
Of course, now I look back and he lied even to this chaplain during our counseling. Not only did he not stop the affair, he continued it and got even more deeply involved. A credit card receipt from his work credit card came to our mail, and I opened it up, and there was charges on there that didn't make sense. He was using his government credit card for her VoIP account so they could communicate. He did not stop at all. So then I'm starting to walk around with this big, deep, dark secret. Because if word got out that he was having an affair, his career's over. You know, the Army doesn't tolerate adultery. And so I had this burden now. I'm like, now what do I do with this? You know, I'd invested everything in him. You know, our family was invested. Our children had sacrificed for him to do what his country called him to do. I believed in it. Our children believed in it.
Chris has a very strong sense of right and wrong, very strong morals.
Jim was about to go down to combat with these guys again. I thought that the disruption of having your commander taken out, I did not want to cause a disruption in the brigade. And I knew I had to dig up whatever strength I had to handle this with as much grace as I could and to protect Jim, protect him from himself at this point.
Despite the betrayal, Chris continues to put Jim's needs first. And so does Jim.
Jim called early November, you know, how soon can you be ready for a trip? I was like, well, where am I going? And he said, I've gotten a plane ticket for you and you're going to leave Italy. The only way I can fix our marriage is for you not to be there when I come home. I want you gone. I didn't know at that point what he was capable of.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do war gaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Noted, I'm Colonel Jim Johnson, commander of the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, stationed in...
Chris Johnson's husband is wielding his powers as an Army colonel to force her from their home in Vicenza, Italy.
In a normal press conference format.
He's kicking me out. Jim had also said on the phone call, I'm revoking your command sponsorship, which means I'm not allowed to stay in Europe as a family member. I'm gone. I can't stay.
It is very unique to see the brigade commander's wife return unless they choose to go home. Very, very odd.
I remember shaking. There was something in the tone of Jim's voice that scared me.
Jim is not only pushing Chris out, he's demanding she leave their children behind.
I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. He's the only Army brigade commander in all of Italy. No one questions you.
There was no way Chris would leave her children in a foreign country and come back to the States without them. No way.
I decided for my safety and my children's safety, we're just gonna leave. So I ran over to the school and withdrew the children. And then I got one-way plane tickets to leave Italy. I fled. I felt like I fled Italy. And I remember landing in JFK, meeting my parents, getting in the car. And I just remember looking out the window and thinking, now what? Now what do I do? I don't have a job. I have no money. I have nothing. Now what?
5 days later, Jim tracks Chris down at her parents' home.
Kept trying to call. He was calling my parents, and finally I just decided, okay, I'll answer the phone and tell him, stop harassing my mom and dad. I'm here. Our children are safe. My children were very angry with him because they knew about the affair. They met her. I mean, they spent a weekend with this woman that they knew their father was involved with.
Over the next 2 months, the battle over custody intensifies.
He had tried 2 emergency injunctions out of a court in Florida to get emergency custody, and were both denied. There was no cause for it.
In response, Jim initiates an obscure legal maneuver called the Hague Petition.
My understanding of the Hague Petition, he was claiming Chris had kidnapped the child and taken the child back to the United States against Jim's wishes, orders, permission.
Jim is desperate for custody.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do wargaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Chris is further stunned when she gets news from Vicenza.
By the end of December, I got a phone call from my neighbor, and she said, Chris, there's been a young woman with a child seen coming and going from your quarters in Vicenza. He had moved his mistress into our house with her kid.
Relationships with foreign nationals are always scrutinized. You're not allowed to have a foreign relationship without reporting that up through your security clearance. It is a security issue.
He just let her roll right in and sleep on my pillow and eat off my dishes. She was just gonna roll in and take the place of Chris Johnson. And it was at that point I realized no one's gonna stop him. He's blatant about the fact that he's having an affair.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him, beyond the point of no return.
That's when I realized, okay, you know, I need to do something. And I thought, that's it. I've got to let the commanding general know. It was a moral decision for me to just sit back and not say anything. How do you look yourself in the mirror? I sat at my parents' computer. I typed like 5 pages, and I disclosed the email accounts that Jim had, the email accounts that Haveen had that I knew she used to communicate with him, the dates that I knew he had been with her, the misuse of government resources, the cell phone, the government credit card, like all the things I knew about.
After receiving Chris's letter, the Army immediately starts an administrative investigation, known as a 15-6.
By February, the 15-6 then rolled into a criminal investigation.
Meanwhile, The battle over the Hague petition escalates.
Jim's contention was that I was kicked off post because I was a disruption. He and his father both wrote affidavits saying that I was this disruption on the Army post, and that's why I was kicked off post, and that I was ordered to leave our children behind. But he was just trying to find anything to make my life hell. Jim called once and said, I'm gonna send U.S. Marshals to the house and, you're gonna get arrested. And that lasted for about 2 months. I mean, it was scary because who deals with a Hague? I'm being, accused of kidnapping our children and across international borders. And, it was 2 months of hell. It was amazing feeling when the judge ruled in my favor. My attorneys cried, I cried. I mean, they were so relieved. Stress will do terrible things to your body. I started getting sick, like a pain, abdominal pain, and found out ultimately that I had a pre-malignant tumor the size of a grapefruit on the tail of my pancreas. I had surgery December of 2011, and it was a much more complicated surgery than they had anticipated, and I ended up in the hospital for a week. I got a phone call from the hospital the day after I came home, and they said, well, we've just tried putting your claim into the military health insurance, and they've denied it. You're not covered. You owe us $100,000.
It was devastating. It's not like she had a lot of money.
As a military spouse, Chris should be fully covered.
I couldn't drive. I was still on meds. I was still, stitches and, still kind of a mess. And so my sister drove me to the ID card office on West Point. And I, sat down with a woman and handed her my ID card, and she pulled up the information on the computer and said, oh, well, you're divorced. I said, no, I'm not. She goes, yeah, on September 23rd, you got divorced. So they got to shred my ID card, and I just lose it. I just start crying. I'm not divorced. But they knew immediately something fishy was up.
West Point's ID card office notifies the Army's Criminal Investigation Division.
They had alerted Army CID. Because of all that, that's when the Army decided to do a preliminary look to investigate.
I get a phone call from Paul Danley, and he introduces himself as the lead CID agent investigating my husband. And he says, here's what we found out. Jim filed divorce registration. I'm gonna scan a copy to you, and I want you to look at it. Your signature's on it. Can you tell me if you've ever seen it before?
That's when everything started to blow up, actually. And it appeared that the divorce decree, or whatever it was called, looked like it was just a copy of a marriage license from when he and Chris got married in New York, with some things changed.
Basically, he created his own certificate of divorce registration. He forged my signature, made up a signature of clerk in Monroe, and signed his name.
He filed that with the military. Again, that's a crime.
He said, oh, and by the way, Jim and Haveen got married. On November 9th, they got married.
I couldn't believe that Colonel Johnson would do this. Fake a divorce decree, and then marry Haveen while he's still married to Chris Johnson.
My husband had committed bigamy. Bigamy. Every time I turned around, I thought, now what?
And then all of a sudden, we're getting calls from Vicenza saying, hey, you need to come here. They found a lot more information than what was in Chris Johnson's letter.
Colonel Jim Johnson, who was once committed to duty, honor, and country, has broken his oath in a startling way.
I mean, he committed bigamy. I remember just saying, I can't make this up. One of my children sent their dad an email later, and all it said was, how was the wedding? Was there cake?
It turns out that Jim has been on the radar of CID investigator Paul Danley for some time.
The whole thing started with a contract fraud investigation over in Afghanistan. The contracting office had alerted Army CID because there was a Colonel Johnson, that was raising a ruckus because his contractor wasn't getting paid. They were fairly low-level contracts. This is for cultural support services. They can understand why Colonel Johnson was berating them for not paying this contract when they had other, bigger issues going on. Water, feeding the troops, etc. And they said it was so bad that, it raised red flags. We thought the investigation was done, and out of the blue, Chris contacted me.
Chris provides the missing piece of the puzzle. The fact that the contractor in question is Jim's mistress's dad, Aladdin Alatar.
Why are you dating the contractor's daughter when you're paying her father? That's a big red flag.
So you got an Iraqi man advising on culture in Afghanistan. Apples, oranges, just didn't make sense.
Aladdin Alatar was actually living in The Hague in the Netherlands. He knew nothing about Afghanistan. So it raised just a lot of questions about why this contract was even signed.
Paul asks Chris to provide anything else she can. Emails, credit card statements, travel records.
They started putting the pieces together. So then when I said, by the way, he was also exchanging bank account information with Aladdin, they realized that there was way more to it. He was having an inappropriate relationship, among other things, fraud, misuse of government resources, the whole 9 yards.
Then we discovered that Colonel Johnson had given a phone to the Alatars, a government phone, I should say. And one of the bills came back, I think it was over $30,000 for a month, just for 1 month of cell phone usage.
But there's more. Investigators going through Jim's computer hard drive uncover questionable financial deals worth millions.
They'd found that Colonel Johnson had tried to have a almost $10 million contract let for windmills. The whole contract was spun up as being a way to get water to troops in remote posts, that they'd be able to produce their own water. So when I talked to the company rep for this windmill company, he explained that they wouldn't work in Afghanistan. Someone was trying to push through a contract, almost $10 million for these windmills that wouldn't work. Why are we doing this?
The money trail leads back to Jim and to Havin's father.
Aladdin Alatar had supposedly found these, or was working for this Dutch company that developed the windmills. If this contract had been signed, Aladdin would have got approximately $500,000 as a finder's fee. So that's a big flag. You get the same contractor, you're dating his daughter, and all of a sudden, he's gonna get $500,000.
Chris's information makes it possible for the Army to build a solid case on Jim's financial misdeeds. They also find blatant proof of Jim's adultery.
Jim and Haveen made a sex tape, and he kept it on his government computer. They found it on his hard drive.
The greatest disgrace is where and when the tryst was recorded.
He was in Iraq and not in Afghanistan with his brigade. His brigade just went off to war. He's supposed to be leading his soldiers, and instead he's screwing around with his mistress. He's not a leader.
Army investigators have learned all they need to know about Jim Johnson. They're ready to prosecute. Jim is arraigned on a total of 27 charges, with a maximum possible sentence of 54 years.
The charges range from adultery, bigamy, fraud, misuse of government resources, and conduct unbecoming of an officer.
The Army flies Chris to Germany to attend a trial her email helped trigger, and which could cost Jim and her everything.
When you're married, as long as I was, to Jim, upon a divorce, you are eligible for up to half of the service member's military retirement. But if Jim's criminal behavior led to him being dismissed or incarcerated, those benefits would have been taken from him, and so then half of nothing would be nothing for me.
Jim's not going to be the only one that's going to be punished. Chris and the children are going to be punished as well.
Made my stomach churn.
Jim Johnson has not been shut down. Even in the midst of a court-martial, he's about to show his own family how destructive he can be.
Jim was going out of his way to do anything he could to cause Chris and their children pain.
It was just unbelievable. I was so hurt. I just blown away, numb.
I think it's horrible. I think that's the worst of it all.
On June 12, 2012, disgraced Army Colonel Jim Johnson gets his day in court, and Chris is there to watch over the proceedings every step of the way.
You know, I remember at one time him looking at me, just, you know, if he could kill me with his eyes, he would have, because I'm the one that blew the whistle.
The original list of 27 charges has come down to 2 counts of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman by the time the trial starts.
He pled guilty to 15 charges. He had to plead guilty to adultery because they had a videotape of it.
I testified during the trial, testified for a couple days at least.
The prosecution presents an irrefutable case, thanks in part to the evidence Chris has provided them.
It seemed like the panel was getting close to, you know, not only convicting him, but, you know, giving him a sentence, you know, involving some incarceration or maybe a dishonorable discharge from the military.
Jim's attorneys now put anyone willing to testify in defense of Jim on the stand, including Jim's father.
His father said, "My son is an honest man. My son's an honorable man. He's not a liar. My son's not a criminal." Dude, your son is a criminal. He just pled guilty to 15 charges, and now you're up on the witness stand saying, "My son's not a criminal." Really?
Both sides rest their case. It takes the jury only a few hours to reach their decision. Jim Johnson is convicted on 2 counts of conduct unbecoming of an officer. The Army pronounces his behavior to be of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces.
What happened to the guy that, you know, embodied duty on our country? You know, what happened to the man that, you know, doesn't lie, cheat, or steal, and or tolerate those who do?
Jim's sentencing hearing is one last chance to acknowledge the pain he's caused. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he uses the opportunity to plead with the court not to send him to jail, so he can care for his beloved Haveen.
He was talking about, you know, allowing him to go back and save her and keep her from being deported. He also made a comment, he's like, "Haveen and her daughter are the center of my life." And one of my children behind me heard that and just started sobbing. You know, our children used to be the center of his life. His family, us, was the center of his life.
He destroyed the relationship with his children. He chose to do that. It's just, it's so sad.
5 years confinement or pay a $300,000 fine. That was his sentence. His father wrote a check for $300,000 and paid the fine. He could have gotten up to 54 years in prison. Instead, he walked out of the courtroom as a colonel with eagles still on his shoulders. Justice wasn't served.
Jim should have gone to jail for what he did, but if he did go to jail, Chris and the children would have been catastrophic for them.
Chris does finally divorce Jim Johnson, for real this time.
From what I understand, he's still with Haveen and her daughter. We have no communication. Our children are essentially estranged from him.
Chris and her kids get half of Jim's pension and benefits. She knows not everyone is as lucky.
There's no whistleblower protection for spouses. So you tolerate illegal and immoral behavior where you turn them in and you risk losing everything. And that's what led me into working on some legislation.
Chris amazes me. She fought for herself and she fought for her children, and now she's fighting for other families.
What we ultimately created was called the Family Served 2 Military Justice Reform Act. And what that would allow is if a service member commits misconduct, it allows the service to properly punish the lawbreaker without financial repercussions on the family. The benefits that the families also earn are protected. So that'll be my swan song from the Army. That'll be the last kind of move I do to help take care of families. I'm at peace where I'm at now, and I hope my story gives other spouses hope. You know, you can rebuild. You can have a happy, successful life after going through something so painful. You know, it's just nice to know that someone else who's dealt with it and has gotten through the tunnel towards the light and life is good again.
The call comes in just after dawn, when Minnesota is still holding its breath under a thin veil of fog, when frost clings to windshields and the streets look deceptively calm, and the voice on the other end of the line is tight, clipped, urgent, a dispatcher repeating an address that will soon be burned into police reports, news archives, and the collective memory of a small community that thought it knew itself. An address tied to a year that refuses to stay buried, the year 2000, a year now. Dragged back into the light by two words that no one here ever expected to hear again in the same sentence. Cold case, solved. Before the arrest, before the handcuffs and the flashing lights and the headlines that would later scream shock and disbelief, there was a morning just like this one, quiet, ordinary, forgettable, the kind of morning that makes evil harder to recognize when it finally shows its face. In the distance, a siren wails and then fades, and for a moment it feels like the past itself is moving, shifting, rearranging, as if something long frozen has cracked, letting old air rush back in. This is how it always begins, not with answers, but with a disturbance, a ripple through time, a sense that something unresolved is about to demand attention. 25 years earlier, Minnesota looked different, but not as different as people like to believe. In 2000, the town at the center of this story was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, where doors were left unlocked, where crime was something that happened somewhere else, on the evening news, in cities far away. It was a place built on routines, on predictable rhythms, on the belief that nothing truly terrible could take root here without someone noticing. That belief would be shattered in a single afternoon, when a routine day slipped quietly into history and never came back out. The victim was ordinary in every way that matters, which is precisely why this case never let go. A familiar face, a known name, a life stitched tightly into the fabric of the town. Someone who went to work, paid bills, made plans, and expected to come home. Someone whose disappearance did not arrive with screams or witnesses or chaos, but with silence, with unanswered phone calls, with a car that never returned to its driveway. At first, there was no panic, only mild concern, the kind that assumes a reasonable explanation is just around the corner. A late meeting, a broken phone, a misunderstanding. But hours passed, then a night, then another morning. Concern thickened into dread. Friends retraced steps. Family members called hospitals, called jails, called anyone who might know something. Police opened a missing persons file that would soon swell into something heavier, darker, something that refused to stay neatly categorized. The word mysterious began to circulate, first in whispers, then in headlines, and the town started to feel washed by its own shadows. The scene where everything seemed to stop was unremarkable at first glance. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood staining the pavement, just absence, clean and unnerving, the kind of emptiness that makes investigators uneasy because it offers nothing to push against. Detectives photographed everything anyway, every angle, every surface, every detail that might later matter more than it seemed to matter now. They took notes, measured distances, bagged items that looked meaningless, because experience had taught them that meaning often arrives late. In the early days of the investigation, tips flooded in. Sightings, rumors, half-remembered conversations. Someone thought they saw the victim at a gas station. Someone else swore they heard shouting the night before. Each lead sparked hope, then collapsed under scrutiny, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The town followed every update obsessively, scanning newspapers, refreshing local news websites, listening to police scanners late into the night. Every new development felt like it might be the breakthrough that would make sense of everything. Instead, the case began to drift. Weeks turned into months. Evidence went cold. Witness memories blurred. The initial urgency faded into a grinding routine of follow-ups and dead ends. Detectives changed assignments. New cases demanded attention. The missing person file grew thicker, heavier, more complicated, but no closer to resolution. The phrase cold case crept into official language, then into everyday conversation, spoken with a mixture of frustration and resignation. For the family, time did not soften anything. It sharpened the pain, turned every unanswered question into a permanent wound. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and left. The empty chair at the table became a symbol no one could ignore. They lived suspended between hope and grief, unable to mourn fully, unable to believe completely, trapped in a state where closure was always promised but never delivered. Each year that passed without answers felt like another betrayal. The community changed too, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Doors locked. Trust eroded. Parents watched their children more closely. The sense of safety that once defined the town became conditional, fragile, something that could be taken away without warning. The cold case was no longer just an investigation. It was a ghost story people told themselves, a reminder that something terrible had happened here and had never been explained. Inside the police department, the file never disappeared. It sat on shelves, moved offices, migrated into digital systems as technology advanced. Every few years, someone would pull it out, review the evidence, re-interview witnesses, chase a new angle sparked by fresh eyes or new tools. DNA testing improved. Databases expanded. Techniques evolved. Each advancement brought a flicker of optimism, quickly extinguished when the results came back inconclusive. The case resisted resolution with stubborn persistence. And then, quietly, something changed. Not with a dramatic announcement or a press conference, but with a notification, a data point, a result that didn't match expectations. A fragment of evidence, long dismissed as too degraded, too incomplete, suddenly had a voice. It spoke not loudly, but clearly enough to demand attention. Investigators leaned in, cautious, unwilling to believe that this could finally be it. Cold cases teach skepticism. They punish hope. The name that surfaced was familiar, unsettlingly so. Not a stranger passing through, not an outsider with no ties to the town, but someone woven into the same social fabric as the victim, someone who had lived, worked, and moved among neighbors unnoticed. The implications were immediate and explosive. If this was true, it meant the danger had never come from elsewhere. It had been here all along, hiding in plain sight. As detectives began to retrace old steps with new purpose, the past seemed to rearrange itself. Conversations once considered insignificant took on new meaning. Timelines shifted. Alibis frayed. Patterns emerged where none had been seen before. The case, dormant for decades, suddenly felt alive, volatile, capable of reshaping everything people thought they knew about that year, about that town, about themselves. Outside, the community went about its business, unaware that history was being rewritten behind closed doors. Children went to school. Shops opened. Coffee was poured. And somewhere, not far away, a decision was being finalized, paperwork prepared, a knock rehearsed in the minds of officers who understood exactly what it would unleash. An arrest in a cold case is never just an arrest. It is an earthquake, sending shockwaves through time, through memory, through trust. When the moment came, it arrived without ceremony. A vehicle pulled up. Doors opened. Words were spoken that could not be taken back. Hands were placed behind a back that had never expected this ending. The past, silent for so long, finally made itself heard. And in that instant, Minnesota's year 2000 was no longer just history. It was present again, demanding reckoning, dragging a stunned community into a truth it was not sure it wanted to face. This was only the beginning. The news breaks the way all seismic events do in a small town, not all at once, but in fragments, a phone vibrating on a kitchen counter, a whispered conversation at a gas station, a headline flashing across a local news site before anyone has had time to prepare for what it means, and suddenly the words Minnesota, 2000, and cold case are no longer relics of an old nightmare, but a living, breathing shockwave moving through the present. People stop what they are doing. Coffee goes untouched. Radios are turned up. The same question is repeated everywhere, quietly at first, then out loud, then in disbelief. How could this happen now, after all this time? For years, the case had existed in a strange limbo, acknowledged but rarely discussed, a story everyone knew yet avoided, like a scar that had healed badly and ached whenever the weather changed. Now it was back, sharper than ever, reopening wounds people thought they had learned to live with. The arrest forces memory into motion. Faces reappear. Scenes replay themselves with cruel clarity. The town remembers where it was when the victim vanished, remembers the posters taped to lampposts, remembers the vigils, the candlelight flickering against uncertainty. What was once distant is suddenly intimate again. Investigators, bound by protocol and restraint, say little publicly at first. They know what the community wants: answers, explanations, reassurance. They also know how fragile this moment is. A single mistake could unravel everything. Inside the department, the atmosphere is tense, electric. Files that once gathered dust are now spread across tables, walls covered in timelines and photographs, red strings tracing connections that were invisible for decades. Every decision is deliberate. Every step forward carries the weight of the past. The suspect's name, when it finally circulates, lands like a physical blow. It is not accompanied by a mugshot or dramatic footage at first, just a name, familiar and unsettling. People recognize it instantly. They remember interactions, conversations, shared spaces. They remember trusting this person, waving to them, standing beside them at school events, community meetings, ordinary moments that now feel contaminated by suspicion. The shock is not just that someone has been arrested. It is who that someone is. In homes across the town, families sit in silence, processing the implications. Parents glance at old photographs, wondering what they missed. Friends replay conversations in their minds, searching for signs that were never noticed at the time. The idea that the answer was always nearby, that the truth lived among them unnoticed, is more disturbing than any theory involving a stranger passing through. It forces a reckoning with the limits of perception, with how easily normalcy can disguise something darker. The investigation, revived with urgency, peels back layers of the past. Detectives revisit the early days of the case, scrutinizing decisions made under pressure, resources stretched thin, technology limited by the era. They acknowledge what everyone now understands. In 2000, the tools simply did not exist to hear what the evidence was trying to say. Samples were collected, preserved, filed away, waiting for a future that could interpret them properly. That future has arrived, and with it, consequences no one can avoid. Witnesses who once believed their memories were irrelevant are contacted again. Some are hesitant, others eager, all aware that time has altered perception. Re-interviews are careful, methodical. Details that once seemed insignificant now align with emerging patterns. A comment dismissed years ago suddenly fits. A timeline once considered airtight develops cracks. The past, it turns out, was never as settled as it appeared. It was simply waiting. For the victim's family, the arrest brings no immediate relief. Instead, it unleashes a complicated surge of emotion that defies easy description. There is validation, yes, a confirmation that their loved one was not forgotten, that persistence mattered. But there is also anger, grief renewed, questions sharpened by the possibility of answers. They are pulled back into a spotlight they never wanted, their private pain transformed once again into public narrative. Every word they speak is weighed, quoted, dissected. Silence becomes both shield and burden. The media descends quickly, cameras lining the streets, reporters framing the story with urgency and drama. Cold case solved becomes a repeated phrase, stripped of nuance, broadcast again and again as if repetition can make the reality easier to digest. But behind the headlines, complexity reigns. This is not a tidy conclusion. It is the opening of a door long sealed, revealing a room filled with unresolved questions, with evidence that must now withstand scrutiny not just from investigators, but from defense attorneys, juries, and a community desperate to understand. As the legal process begins to grind forward, the suspect remains largely silent, shielded by counsel, expression unreadable in the few images that surface. That silence becomes its own source of speculation. People search for meaning in posture, in a glance, in the absence of denial or confession. Every detail is magnified, analyzed, shared. The town becomes a courtroom of opinion, where everyone is both juror and witness, grappling with what justice should look like after so much time has passed. Meanwhile, the physical spaces connected to the case take on new significance. The street where the victim was last seen draws quiet visitors. Cars slow as they pass. Some people stop, standing at a distance, unsure what they are looking for, aware only that something important happened here and that it has not been fully resolved. Memory clings to geography. Places remember even when people try to forget. The cold case, once frozen, is now volatile. Each development threatens to reshape the narrative, to challenge assumptions held for decades. Investigators proceed carefully, aware that the margin for error is slim. They are not just building a case. They are rewriting history, confronting the consequences of time, technology, and human fallibility. In the days following the arrest, sleep comes hard for many in the community. Dreams are restless, filled with fragments of the past colliding with the present. The sense of safety, already fragile, fractures further under the weight of revelation. People realize that closure, so often promised in stories like this, is not guaranteed. Sometimes answers arrive too late to heal cleanly. Sometimes they only deepen the ache. And as the town waits for what comes next, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Solving a cold case does not end the story. It changes it. It drags buried truths into the open and forces everyone involved to confront what they thought they knew. The past is no longer silent. It is speaking loudly now, and it is not finished. As the days stretch on after the arrest, the weight of the revelation settles unevenly across the town, pressing harder in some places than others. And nowhere is that pressure more intense than inside the investigation itself, where detectives now move through the past with a sense of urgency sharpened by consequence. This is no longer an abstract pursuit of truth. This is preparation for judgment. Every box of evidence reopened carries risk. Every assumption is questioned. Every detail is handled as if it could be the one that decides everything. They start at the beginning, not because it is dramatic, but because it is necessary. The first report, the first officer on scene, the first decisions made when time still felt generous and answers seemed close. In retrospect, those early hours loom large, not as failures, but as moments defined by what was unknowable then. The detectives know this. They also know the defense will not care. The case must speak clearly now, without excuses, without ambiguity. Evidence that once seemed inert begins to assert itself. Old photographs are digitized, enhanced, re-examined. Logs are cross-checked against timelines rebuilt from scratch. Phone records, once limited by technology, are reconstructed with new precision. Each recovered detail adds texture, context, and sometimes discomfort. It becomes clear that the truth was never absent. It was fragmented, scattered across years, waiting for the right conditions to coalesce. The DNA, the fragment that reignited everything, is treated with almost reverent caution. Chain of custody is traced obsessively. Every hand that touched it is accounted for. Every storage condition documented. There is no room for doubt here. This single piece of evidence must withstand every challenge, every attempt to undermine its credibility. It is both a breakthrough and a liability, powerful but fragile, capable of reshaping the case or destroying it if mishandled. As investigators dig deeper, they encounter resistance not from the suspect, but from time itself. Memories have faded. Some witnesses have moved away. Others have died. Some cannot be found at all. The town that once surrounded the case has thinned, its population changed, its social networks rearranged. Reconstructing the past now requires patience and imagination, the ability to listen not just to what people say, but to what they no longer remember. When former acquaintances of the suspect are interviewed again, reactions vary wildly. Some are defensive, quick to insist they never suspected anything, that there were no signs, no red flags. Others are quieter, shaken, admitting that certain moments now feel different in hindsight, that things once dismissed as quirks or coincidences now seem heavier, darker. These conversations are recorded carefully, knowing that hindsight is a dangerous lens, but also knowing that patterns often reveal themselves only after the fact. The suspect's life, once unremarkable, is dissected with forensic precision. Employment history, relationships, financial records, movements around the time of the disappearance. Each data point is mapped against the reconstructed timeline, searching for inconsistencies, for gaps, for opportunities that align too neatly with what happened. Nothing is assumed. Everything must be proven. Meanwhile, the legal machinery begins to turn. Prosecutors enter the scene, bringing a different kind of intensity, one focused not on discovery, but on presentation. They ask hard questions, not out of doubt, but necessity. Can this be proven beyond reasonable doubt? Will a jury believe it after all these years? How will the defense explain the delay? Every answer must be anticipated, every weakness addressed before it can be exploited. For the family, this phase is particularly cruel. The arrest had reopened the door to hope, but the slow, methodical pace of the process now tests their endurance. They attend meetings, listen to explanations heavy with legal language, try to understand what comes next. They are told to be patient, to trust the process, words they have heard too many times before. Patience, after decades, feels like another burden imposed without consent. Public reaction evolves as well. The initial shock gives way to debate, speculation, and division. Some people embrace the narrative of resolution eagerly, relieved to believe that justice, however delayed, is finally within reach. Others are skeptical, uncomfortable with the idea that a life can be reconstructed and judged so long after the fact. Social media amplifies every opinion, every rumor, every half-understood detail, creating a parallel trial that unfolds in real time, unconstrained by evidence or procedure. The suspect's silence continues, and in that silence, people project their own interpretations. Guilt, innocence, fear, defiance. Each observer sees what they expect to see. Investigators, trained to resist this impulse, focus instead on what can be demonstrated. They know that narratives are seductive but unreliable. Only facts will survive the courtroom. Late nights become routine. Lights stay on in offices long after the building should be empty. Detectives read and reread reports, cross-reference statements, double-check dates. Fatigue sets in, but it is sharpened by purpose. This case, once a symbol of failure, now represents a rare opportunity to close a chapter that has haunted the department for decades. The pressure is immense, but so is the resolve. Outside, the town struggles to reconcile its image of itself with what is emerging. The idea that someone could live among them for years, carrying a secret of this magnitude, unsettles long-held assumptions about safety and familiarity. People look at each other differently now, aware that knowing someone does not mean understanding them. Trust, once broken, does not repair easily. Physical reminders of the case take on renewed importance. Evidence lockers, old notebooks, even mundane objects collected years ago now feel charged with significance. Each item is a potential bridge between then and now, a chance to translate the past into a language the present can understand. As the case moves closer to formal charges, a sense of inevitability begins to take hold. The path forward is narrowing. Options are closing. Decisions made long ago are converging on a single point in time. There is no turning back, only forward into uncertainty. And beneath it all runs a quieter current, an awareness shared by everyone involved, but rarely spoken aloud. Solving a cold case does not erase what happened. It does not restore what was lost. It cannot undo years of absence or pain. What it can do is confront the silence, replace speculation with accountability, and force a community to look directly at a truth it has avoided for too long. The past, once distant and blurred, is now sharp and insistent. It demands answers, not just from the person accused, but from everyone who lived alongside the mystery for so many years. And as the investigation presses on, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Whatever the outcome, nothing will ever feel the same again. The closer the case moves toward court, the more the atmosphere tightens, as if the town itself is holding its breath, aware that something definitive is approaching but uncertain what shape it will take. This is the phase where optimism collides with reality, where the promise of answers must survive the unforgiving structure of law. Investigators feel it first, That subtle shift from pursuit to defense, from asking what happened to proving how and why, a transition that transforms every detail into potential leverage or liability. They begin rehearsing the story the evidence tells, not as a narrative meant to comfort, but as one designed to endure scrutiny. Every photograph, every statement, every data point must align, must reinforce the same conclusion from multiple angles. Inconsistencies that once seemed trivial now loom large. A misplaced date, a vague memory, a procedural shortcut taken decades ago under pressure. The past does not forgive easily, and it does not care about intention. Meetings become more frequent, more intense. Prosecutors push investigators to articulate not just what they believe, but how they will explain it to 12 strangers with no emotional investment in the case's history. Juries, they remind everyone, do not inherit the weight of decades. They see only what is presented in front of them, filtered through rules that are indifferent to frustration and grief. The challenge is not uncovering the truth anymore. It is translating it. Defense strategy begins to take shape as well, visible in filings, motions, carefully worded statements. The argument is predictable, but no less potent for it. Too much time has passed, memories are unreliable, evidence has degraded, assumptions have replaced facts. The cold case itself becomes a weapon, its age framed as a reason for doubt rather than persistence. The delay, once seen as injustice, is recast as weakness. This reframing unsettles the community. People who had embraced the arrest as closure now confront the possibility that resolution is not guaranteed. Doubt creeps in, not necessarily about guilt or innocence, but about the system's ability to deliver something definitive after so long. Conversations shift tone. Certainty softens into caution. The phrase, "we'll see," becomes common, a verbal hedge against disappointment. For the family, this period is agonizing. They are close enough to imagine an ending, but far enough to fear another collapse. Each legal development is dissected privately, its implications weighed with painful care. They learn to live inside conditional language. If the evidence holds, if the jury understands, if the past can be made clear. Hope, once a distant memory, now feels fragile, something that could be taken away with a single ruling. Investigators revisit the suspect's movements around the time of the disappearance yet again, not because they expect to find something new, but because repetition reveals weaknesses. They trace routes, reconstruct days, account for minutes. Where was the suspect supposed to be, and where can that be independently verified? Alibis that once went unquestioned are tested against records, against logic, against the quiet inconsistencies that time can expose. The town watches these developments through a fog of partial information. Official statements are sparse, careful. Rumors fill the gaps. Social media thrives on speculation, turning legal nuance into simplified narratives that spread faster than corrections ever could. Some people grow impatient, demanding faster answers, louder declarations. Others retreat, wary of speaking at all, mindful that certainty has a way of backfiring in cases like this. Physical evidence continues to command attention. Items collected decades ago are presented as if newly discovered, their significance reframed through modern analysis. The contrast is striking: old materials, new interpretations. It underscores an uncomfortable truth about the case, that justice here depends as much on technological progress as on human effort. Without it, the silence might have remained permanent. Behind the scenes, investigators confront a more personal reckoning. Many of them were not part of the original case. They inherited it, with all its unresolved weight. Now, as they approach a possible conclusion, they feel both pride and pressure, aware that their work will be measured not just against standards of professionalism, but against decades of expectation. Failure would not be quiet. It would echo backward through time. The suspect remains a distant figure, present in documents and procedures, but absent from public understanding. This distance fuels imagination. People wonder what it means to carry such a secret for so long, to move through life under the cover of normalcy. Others resist this line of thought entirely, preferring to focus on outcomes rather than psychology. Motivation, after all, is not required for conviction. As the case edges closer to its next decisive phase, a sense of inevitability returns, different from before, heavier, more complex. This is not the inevitability of discovery, but of confrontation. The system will demand answers now, and it will do so on its own terms. The past will be questioned, challenged, reshaped in public view. In quiet moments, some in the town reflect on what justice actually means here. Is it a verdict? A sentence? An acknowledgement of harm? Or simply the end of uncertainty? There is no consensus, only a shared awareness that whatever comes next will leave its mark. The cold case, once defined by absence, is now defined by tension. It has become a living thing again, restless, unresolved, pulling everyone toward a moment where silence will no longer be an option. And as that moment approaches, the community braces itself, knowing that answers, when they arrive, rarely bring the peace people imagine. The first day of hearings arrives without spectacle, no dramatic procession, no cinematic unveiling, just a courthouse bathed in flat morning light and a line of people waiting in silence, each carrying their own version of the story inside them. This is where the cold case steps fully into the present, shedding the distance of years and becoming immediate, procedural, unforgiving. Inside, the air is heavy with expectation, the kind that presses down on every word before it is spoken. For investigators, this moment is a test of endurance. Everything they have reconstructed must now withstand not just curiosity, but challenge. The evidence is no longer theirs alone. It belongs to the court, to rules that demand precision and punish assumption. Every statement is measured. Every exhibit is introduced with care. There is no room for narrative flourish here, only clarity. The defense moves quickly to establish its frame. They emphasize the passage of time, the erosion of memory, the dangers of retrospective certainty. They speak of lost witnesses, degraded samples, investigative tunnel vision. The phrase reasonable doubt hangs over the room like a refrain, repeated until it begins to feel less like a legal standard and more like a warning. The message is clear. Time itself is on trial here, and time is an unreliable witness. The prosecution responds with restraint, aware that overreach would be fatal. They focus on continuity, on how disparate elements converge despite the years between them. They explain, patiently, how evidence preserved long ago can speak with greater accuracy now than it ever could then. Technology becomes a character in the story, not as savior, but as translator, allowing the past to finally be understood. When the DNA evidence is addressed, the room shifts. Attention sharpens. This is the hinge on which everything turns. Experts speak in careful language, explaining processes, probabilities, safeguards. They are precise, methodical, aware that misunderstanding could unravel months of preparation. The science is complex, but the implication is simple. The evidence points to one individual, and it does so with a clarity that did not exist before. Still, certainty is elusive. The defense challenges methodology, storage conditions, statistical interpretation. They do not need to disprove the evidence, only to destabilize it. Each question is designed to introduce hesitation, to remind the court that science, like memory, is mediated by human hands. Watching this exchange, the family feels the ground shift beneath them again. What seems solid now feels conditional. Outside the courtroom, the town listens. News updates are parsed obsessively. Sound bites replace nuance. Some residents grow impatient with the caution of the proceedings, craving the decisive language of headlines rather than the careful phrasing of law. Others appreciate the restraint, recognizing that justice rushed is justice undone. The divide widens quietly, reflecting different relationships to the case and its outcome. The suspect's presence in the courtroom is almost incidental, a figure defined more by process than personality. Their reactions, if any, are minimal, their demeanor neutral, carefully managed. This absence of visible emotion becomes another canvas for projection. Some interpret it as guilt, others as resolve. The truth, if it exists in expression at all, remains hidden behind legal strategy. As testimony continues, fragments of the past are reintroduced into public consciousness. Old photographs, once private, are displayed under harsh lighting. Familiar locations are described in detail, stripped of nostalgia and rendered clinical. The victim's life, reduced to evidence, is both honored and exposed, a necessary discomfort that underscores the cost of delay. For the family, each detail is a reopening. They sit through descriptions they have heard before, now delivered with new context, new implications. There is no escaping the sense that their grief is being measured, weighed, tested alongside everything else. They endure it because endurance has become second nature. Investigators watch closely, not just for outcomes, but for comprehension. Are their explanations landing? Are connections being made? The courtroom is a place where truth must compete with doubt, where clarity is fragile and easily disrupted. Every nod, every furrowed brow is noted, not as verdict, but as signal. As the hearings stretch on, fatigue sets in, not just physical, but emotional. The case demands sustained attention, sustained patience, qualities that are difficult to maintain under the glare of public expectation. Yet there is no alternative. This is the process. This is the cost of bringing a cold case back to life. By the end of the day, nothing is resolved. No declarations are made. No conclusions drawn. And yet, something has shifted. The story, once abstract, now exists in shared space, shaped by rules and voices that will determine its future. The cold case has entered a new phase, one defined not by discovery, but by deliberation, and everyone involved understands that the hardest part may still be ahead. By the time the case reaches its next stage, the town has learned a new kind of routine, one built around updates and pauses, around legal language that feels both precise and maddeningly incomplete, because the courtroom does not move at the speed of grief, and it certainly does not move at the speed of headlines. People gather in small clusters outside diners and grocery stores, trading half-confirmed details like contraband, lowering their voices when strangers pass, as if the truth itself might fracture if spoken too loudly. The phrase cold case is everywhere now, on lips, on screens, on the local radio that can't stop replaying the same few facts because those facts are all anyone has, and every repetition carries the same ache. After 25 years, how can the answers still feel so distant? Inside the courthouse, the temperature is kept cool, almost sterile, as if the building is designed to discourage emotion, but emotion leaks in any way, clinging to the edges of every proceeding. The family sits with a posture that looks like composure from a distance, but up close it's something else entirely, a practiced stillness, a way of holding themselves together so they don't come apart in front of strangers. They've become experts at waiting, and the most cruel part is that waiting is still required even now, when the world insists this is solved, when the headlines are already writing the ending that the law has not yet allowed. The prosecution begins to tighten the story, not by embellishing it, but by removing the air pockets, the gaps where doubt can hide. They bring forward witnesses who can anchor time, people who remember ordinary details because ordinary details are the ones that survive, the ones that weren't contaminated by panic. A coworker recalls a schedule change. A neighbor remembers the sound of a car at an unusual hour. A clerk remembers a purchase made without small talk. Each testimony feels small on its own, but together they form a pattern, a grid laid over the past, narrowing the space where the suspect could claim to have been elsewhere. The jury listens, and you can feel them recalibrating, learning to see the year 2000 not as a blurry memory, but as a sequence of minutes that can still be mapped. Then comes the part the town is most hungry for and most afraid of at the same time. Motive, the invisible engine everyone assumes must exist, the thing that would make the story make sense. But the prosecution doesn't promise motive. They don't need it, not legally. They focus on opportunity, on connection, on the ways a familiar face can move without drawing suspicion. They lay out relationships the community never looked at too closely because closeness felt safe. They hint at proximity without dramatizing it, because dramatization is what the defense wants, a chance to argue that the case is built on narrative rather than proof. The defense answers by trying to shake the frame, to make the timeline look less like a grid and more like a fog. They push witnesses on memory, on how time alters certainty, on how suggestion can masquerade as recollection. They ask questions that sound gentle but carry a blade. Are you sure? How sure? Did you write it down? Did you tell anyone then? They remind the jury, again and again, that certainty decades later is not the same thing as certainty in the moment. They are not trying to prove innocence by explaining the past. They are trying to prove uncertainty by breaking it into pieces. And then, Like a cold wind slipping under a door, a new detail enters the room, not entirely new, but newly emphasized, newly weaponized. The defense points to a decision made early in the investigation, a path not taken, a lead that was pursued briefly and then abandoned. A name that hovered on the margins years ago, someone who was questioned, cleared, forgotten. The defense doesn't have to resurrect that person fully. They only have to show that the investigation once looked somewhere else, that the certainty of today did not exist then. The implication spreads quickly. If police once suspected another, how can they be sure now? The prosecution expected this, but expectation doesn't remove the sting. They respond by walking the court through the evolution of the evidence, explaining that the case did not pivot on instinct or guesswork, but on what the evidence allowed at the time. They explain the limitations of 2000 without sounding like they are making excuses, because juries dislike excuses. They describe preservation, chain of custody, the reason certain samples were stored even when they couldn't yet be interpreted. They speak of patience not as virtue, but as strategy, because this is what cold cases are, long games played against time, and sometimes time finally blinks. When the DNA expert returns to the stand, the room leans forward again, drawn to the idea that science can deliver what humans could not. The expert speaks carefully, and the prosecutor keeps the questions clear, simple, almost surgical. The defense then takes its turn, probing at probability, at interpretation, at the possibility, however slim, that the match could be misleading. They bring up contamination in theory, not by accusing anyone directly, but by letting the word itself hang in the air, because some words are powerful even without proof. Contamination, transfer, secondary contact. The jury absorbs these terms, and you can feel doubt trying to stretch its legs. Outside, the town absorbs its own version of doubt. People start revisiting the past not as memory, but as evidence. They dig out old yearbooks and newsletters. They replay conversations they hadn't thought about in years. They remember who lived where, who worked which shift, who attended which community event. It becomes a kind of informal investigation, messy and emotional, fueled by the need to feel control over a narrative that has been out of reach for so long. Some people turn defensive, angry at the implication that their town harbored something awful. Others turn accusatory, eager to point fingers at anyone who feels adjacent to the suspect. The arrest that shocked the community now begins to splinter it. For the family, the splintering is its own cruelty. They are not watching a mystery anymore. They are watching their loss become public property, debated and dissected. They hear strangers talk about their loved one as if they are discussing a story, not a human life. They hear people argue about whether an arrest is enough, whether evidence is enough, whether time itself should be allowed to interfere with accountability. And in the quiet moments, the family's private questions press harder. If this is truly the person responsible, why now? What changed? What finally moved the needle? What did we all miss? There is a moment in the courtroom, small, easy to overlook, that changes the tone of everything. A witness is asked about contact between the victim and the suspect, and the witness hesitates, then mentions something that had never made it into the public narrative, something the town did not know. Not a dramatic secret, not a confession, but an interaction that suggests familiarity deeper than casual acquaintance. The words land softly, but their effect is immediate. The room shifts. The jury shifts. The family stiffens, not because it is shocking in a sensational way, but because it is intimate, because it hints at a private thread running through the case, a thread that might explain how a crime could occur without an explosion, without a witness, without the chaos everyone expects. The defense tries to contain it, to frame it as speculation, as misinterpretation, but you can feel the idea taking root. If the victim trusted the suspect, even briefly, even in a small way, then the disappearance becomes more chilling because it becomes easier. No forced entry, no struggle in public view, just a door opened, a conversation, a moment of misplaced trust, and then absence. The prosecutor doesn't dramatize this. They don't need to. The concept is terrifying enough on its own. As the day ends, people leave the courthouse with that detail echoing in their minds, and outside the cameras wait, hungry for anything that sounds like certainty. But certainty is still out of reach. The legal machine continues, slow and relentless, while the town races ahead emotionally, writing endings in their heads, erasing them, writing new ones. The family returns home to a house that feels too quiet, like the silence is listening. Investigators go back to their offices to prepare for the next day, knowing that each witness, each exhibit, each argument is a thread, and the case will either hold together under tension or come apart. That night, in Minnesota, winter air sharpens against windows, and somewhere a porch light flickers, and in that flicker the year 2000 feels close again, not like history, but like a shadow standing just outside the door. People lie awake and realize something they didn't want to admit when the arrest was announced. The arrest did not end the fear. It changed it. The fear is no longer about not knowing. It is about knowing, or thinking you know, and still having to wait for the world to agree, still having to watch the truth crawl forward one careful step at a time, while the past, impatient and relentless, keeps pressing closer. The next morning, the courthouse feels less like a building and more like a pressure chamber, because everyone walks in carrying the same invisible question, the one no headline can answer and no rumor can satisfy. What actually happened in Minnesota in 2000? And why did it take a quarter century for anyone to say it out loud with confidence? The benches fill again, the same faces returning like a ritual, reporters with notebooks poised, locals with tight mouths and sleepless eyes, the family seated as if they're bracing against wind, and the case moves forward with that slow, relentless momentum that makes time feel distorted, like the clock is moving but nothing is changing, until suddenly it does. The prosecution begins to assemble what they call a bridge, not just between suspect and victim, but between the moment of disappearance and everything that followed, because cold cases don't just go unsolved. They linger, they seep into marriages and friendships and careers, they shape entire communities without anyone noticing the shape they're taking. They bring in a witness who once lived close enough to hear the town's heartbeat at night, someone who remembers the ordinary sounds, the patterns, the way a quiet street can still tell you when something is wrong. The witness doesn't claim to have seen the crime, doesn't pretend to hold the missing piece like a dramatic reveal, but they describe a detail that has weight precisely because it is small, a vehicle out of place, an engine idling too long, the kind of thing you notice and dismiss because you have no reason, in the moment, to treat it as a warning. The prosecutor asks careful questions, almost gentle, and the witness answers with the brittle clarity of someone who has been asked to reopen a drawer they kept locked for years. The defense rises and attacks the familiar target, memory. They point out how easy it is to rewrite your own recollection once you know the ending. They suggest that the witness's mind has had 25 years to edit the scene, to make it fit the story everyone is now telling. They ask whether the witness mentioned this detail in 2000, whether it appears in original notes, whether it was reported immediately or only remembered later. The witness hesitates, and that hesitation becomes a tool, because in court, hesitation can look like uncertainty even when it's simply fear of being wrong. The defense repeats the question in different forms, pressing until the witness admits the truth. They didn't realize it mattered then. The defense doesn't need anything more. They sit down as if they've proven a point, because they have. Not that the witness is lying, but that time is a contaminant of its own kind. Then the prosecution does something subtle, something that shifts the rhythm of the room. They stop relying on memory and turn to paper, to records, to the silent witnesses that do not forget. They introduce documents that place the suspect within a certain radius, within a certain window, within a certain pattern of behavior that aligns too neatly with opportunity. It's not a single dramatic document, not a smoking gun that makes everyone gasp, but a series of confirmations, small nails driven one after another, until the frame begins to hold. Receipts. Logs. A record of movement that suggests a route, not definitive on its own, but persuasive when woven together. The jurors lean forward, not because they've been entertained, but because the case is beginning to feel less like an old mystery and more like an engineered structure, built to withstand shaking. And still, the defense has its own structure, and it is built around one concept: alternative. Alternative suspect. Alternative interpretation. Alternative explanation for every link the prosecution tries to secure. They introduce the idea that the victim could have encountered someone else, that the community's need for closure is pushing them toward the most convenient narrative, that the arrest has colored every piece of evidence like a stain. They imply that investigators, hungry to solve what haunted them, may have stepped too confidently into a conclusion. They do not have to prove this beyond doubt. They only have to make it plausible enough to create space, because space is where reasonable doubt lives. The courtroom becomes a battle over what solved even means. The public wants the simple version, the crisp ending, the headline that ties a bow around tragedy. The law wants something else, a chain that cannot break, a story that survives cross-examination, a conclusion that can be justified without leaning on emotion. Outside, people are still saying cold case solved. But inside, that phrase feels premature, almost dangerous, because the jury has not agreed. And until the jury agrees, the past is still up for debate. At midday, a break is called, and the hallway outside the courtroom fills with murmur and movement, families whispering, reporters making calls, locals staring at the floor as if it might provide answers. The victim's relatives stand close together like a single organism, protective, exhausted, and there's a moment where someone reaches out to touch another's arm. Not dramatic, not performative, just human, a reminder that this is not a story for them. It's a life that stopped, a life that never resumed. When people call this a case, the family hears absence. When people say evidence, the family hears years. When people say closure, the family hears finally, and then immediately hears the fear behind it. What if not? The proceedings resume, and now the prosecution brings forward a specialist to speak about reconstruction, about how investigators can rebuild a timeline not by guessing, but by stacking independent sources until a picture forms. The specialist explains that in 2000, a person could disappear with fewer digital footprints, but not none, and the trick is knowing where to look, how to interpret what remains. The words are technical, but the effect is emotional, because every explanation is a reminder that the truth was always there in some form, waiting for enough patience, enough technology, enough stubborn refusal to let the silence win. The defense counters with its own expert, someone who speaks about limitations, about the risk of overconfidence, about how patterns can be seductive, how humans are built to connect dots even when dots do not belong together. It is a duel of credibility, and the jury is caught between them, watching two authoritative voices describe two different kinds of certainty. The courtroom holds its breath. In cases like this, expertise is not just information, it is persuasion. And then, late in the day, something happens that doesn't explode like drama but settles like ice, because it touches the core fear that has stalked the community since the arrest. The idea that the suspect was not just near the victim, not just capable, but known, familiar, trusted enough to move without raising alarms. The prosecution introduces testimony about routine contact, about overlapping circles, about ordinary interactions that once meant nothing. They do not paint the suspect as a monster in public view. They paint the suspect as normal. And that is what makes the room colder. Because monsters are easy to isolate in the mind. Normal is not. People in the audience shift uncomfortably. Some avoid looking at the suspect. Others can't stop looking. The feeling is not hatred yet, not fully, but something more unsettling, recognition. The sense that if this person could be involved, then anyone could, and the town's old belief in its own safety was not just naive, it was vulnerable by design. The defense tries to pull the focus back to process, to insist that familiarity does not equal guilt, that proximity does not equal proof, that the prosecution is asking the jury to fill gaps with intuition. They remind everyone that the victim is not here to speak, that the suspect has the right to silence, that assumptions are not evidence. Their voice is steady, practiced, and for a moment the room feels like it's tilting again, doubt stretching in the open space between what people want to believe and what can be proven. But the prosecution has been saving something. Not a dramatic reveal, not a confession, but a piece of consistency, an element that ties earlier testimony to documented behavior, something that suggests not just presence, but knowledge, the kind of knowledge that would be hard to explain away. The prosecutor is careful as they present it, as if they know exactly how easily the jury could recoil from anything that feels like overreach. They let the piece speak quietly, and quiet is often more powerful than loud, because quiet forces people to lean in. As the day closes, the judge calls an end, and everyone stands, The ritual of procedure, the scrape of benches, the shuffle of papers. The family remains seated for a beat too long, as if standing is an admission that time is still moving, still pulling them forward whether they're ready or not. The suspect is led away, expression contained, the kind of containment that makes people furious because they want a visible crack, a visible acknowledgement of what the town has carried for so long. Outside, the air feels sharper, and the cameras capture faces that look older than they did yesterday, because each day in court is a day spent living inside the worst year of someone's life, again and again, until it reshapes you. The town goes home, but home feels different now, like a place that can no longer pretend it is untouched. People lock doors. People check windows. People sit at kitchen tables and speak in low voices about what they heard, what they think, what they fear. And beneath every conversation runs the same uneasy current. If the truth is finally here, why does it still feel like it could slip away? That night, the past presses close again, not as a distant story, but as a living tension in the walls, and the phrase that started this whole storm. Minnesota 2000 cold case solved hangs in the air like a headline that might be true or might be premature, a declaration that the courtroom has not yet earned, a promise that the community is terrified to believe too soon. The morning the next witness is scheduled, the town wakes up with a strange sensation, like it's living inside a replay, like the same day keeps returning with slightly different angles, slightly different words, but the same tension humming underneath everything. The courthouse parking lot fills early again, cars pulling in with headlights still on, people stepping out as if they're entering a storm shelter rather than a building meant for order. Reporters hover near the entrance, scanning faces for emotion the way predators scan for movement, because emotion is the currency of a story, and this story has been feeding an audience for weeks. But inside, emotion is tightly controlled. Inside, everything is measured. Even grief must obey procedure. When the courtroom settles, the silence feels thicker than it should. The judge's voice cuts through it like a blade. Routine phrases that still sound unreal because they are attached to a year that never stopped haunting this community. The prosecution stands, and you can sense the shift in their strategy. Up to now, they have been building structure, laying beams, tightening joints, showing patterns and records in careful alignment. Now they do something more dangerous. They begin to bring the past into the room in a way that isn't just factual, but visceral, not through gore, not through spectacle, but through the intimate details that make a person real. The victim's habits, the victim's schedule, the victim's small routines that once felt like nothing and now feel like evidence of a life interrupted. They talk about the last known day, not as a myth, not as a dramatic reenactment, but as a sequence of normal moments that become terrifying only because they end. A phone call made without urgency, a plan mentioned casually, a timeline anchored by mundane confirmations. The prosecutor's voice remains calm, but the calmness is almost brutal because it refuses to soften what is being implied, that the victim's life was moving forward with no warning, no preparation, and then it was cut off from the world like a wire snapped clean. The defense watches closely, because this is where juries can be swayed by emotion, and the defense cannot allow the prosecution to turn sorrow into certainty. When the defense rises, they remind the court that a tragic end is not proof of who caused it. Their tone is steady, disciplined. They talk about the danger of letting heartbreak fill gaps that evidence cannot. They talk about sympathy, about the human impulse to want a villain, to want an ending. They do not deny the loss. They simply refuse to allow the loss to become a verdict. Then the prosecution calls a witness whose name is familiar not just to the case, but to the town itself, someone who has been living under the shadow of this cold case for decades, someone whose memory has been requested, doubted, and re-requested until it feels like a piece of public property. The witness walks in slowly, shoulders tight, eyes fixed forward, and you can feel the room stiffen. This is not just testimony. This is a collision between the private and the public, between what a person remembers and what the world wants them to remember. The prosecutor asks the witness to describe their relationship to the victim, and the answer is simple, factual, but loaded. The witness describes routine contact, the kind that meant safety at the time, the kind that now feels like a trap. They describe the last interaction they can confirm, not with dramatic language, but with the blunt honesty of someone who has repeated the same story for years. The witness's voice trembles once, and the tremble ripples through the room, because everyone understands that this case did not freeze in 2000. It kept moving. It kept taking pieces out of people. When the prosecutor moves toward the subject of the suspect, the air changes again. The witness confirms familiarity. Not a vague recognition, not a distant awareness, but a knowing familiarity that sits heavy on the jury's faces, because familiarity is the most unsettling element of this entire story. A stranger is easy to imagine. A stranger fits the old comfort of it could happen anywhere. But familiarity makes it local. Familiarity makes it personal. Familiarity turns the community's own trust into part of the crime scene. The defense rises quickly, and you can feel the tactic before it's even spoken. Dismantle confidence, expose uncertainty, remind everyone that time is a filter. The defense asks the witness about the year 2000, about what they said then, about what they didn't say then. They circle around details like a hawk, waiting for a wobble. They ask whether the witness's memories have changed over time. They ask whether the witness has discussed the case with others. They ask whether the witness has seen news coverage, read headlines, absorbed the same narrative the town has been consuming. With every question, they are planting a seed. Contamination of memory, contamination of perception, contamination of certainty. The witness tries to answer carefully. The witness admits what every honest person must admit. Time changes you. Time changes memory. Time changes the way you interpret what you saw. The defense pounces on that admission, not maliciously, but efficiently, because their job is not kindness. Their job is doubt. Their job is to make the jury wonder whether this witness is recalling the past or reconstructing it. The prosecution redirects, and this is where the case pivots again, away from the fragile ground of memory and back onto something harder. They introduce corroboration. Not a dramatic revelation, not a hidden tape, but confirmations that align with the witness's account in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Records that existed before the arrest, before the headlines, before the narrative hardened. The prosecutor does not shout. They do not triumph. They simply stack one confirmation on top of another until the witness's story looks less like a lonely recollection and more like a piece of a larger, consistent picture. The defense counters with the oldest weapon in a cold case, the missing. They point out what cannot be presented. The lost witness. The statement never recorded. The tip never followed. They suggest that the case is a puzzle with pieces that no longer exist, and that the prosecution is asking the jury to accept a completed image anyway. They stress the danger of certainty built on absence. They make the jury feel the hollow spaces, because hollow spaces are where acquittals are born. Then something happens that no one planned for. Not a confession, not an outburst, but a moment of human fracture. It's subtle at first. The victim's family reacts to something said on the stand, not loudly, not theatrically, but visibly. A hand clenches. A breath stops. Someone's eyes close like they've been struck. It is a reminder that this case is not an intellectual exercise. It is a wound that has been reopened in front of strangers with microphones. The room feels the shift, and even the judge's routine posture tightens slightly, as if the court itself can sense how close this is to breaking through its own controlled surface. In the hallway during recess, you can hear the town's heartbeat, a low murmur of voices, fragments of conversation. People aren't just discussing evidence. They're discussing their own past, their own choices, their own proximity. Someone says, "I knew them." Someone else says, "I never would have guessed." Another person says, "What if it's wrong?" And that last question is the one that hangs longest, because it is terrifying in both directions. If it's wrong, an innocent life could be destroyed. If it's right, then the town lived beside the truth for years and did nothing because it didn't know it needed to. Back inside, the prosecution introduces another element that feels mundane until you realize what it implies: behavior after the disappearance. Not violence, not dramatic acts, but patterns of conduct that suggest knowledge, that suggest an adjustment, the kind of adjustment people make when they are carrying something heavy. The prosecutor frames it carefully because behavior is interpretive, and interpretive evidence can backfire. But they do not present it alone. They present it alongside other anchors, other points of confirmation, so the jury isn't asked to leap, only to step. The defense predictably, calls it speculation. They insist that grief can make patterns appear where none exist, that communities reshape narratives to survive them, that investigators, after years of failure, can become hungry for the satisfaction of solving what once defeated them. They warn against what they call the romance of the cold case, the public's love for a dramatic resolution, the media's hunger for the phrase solved, the way a headline can create momentum that evidence must struggle to match. The day ends with no verdict, no cinematic closure, only the slow ritual of adjournment, the scrape of chairs, the shuffling of documents, the judge's steady voice sending everyone back into the world as if the world is normal. But outside, it isn't. Outside, the community is changed each day by what it hears, by what it suspects, by what it cannot unhear. People drive home and pass familiar streets that now feel like part of the evidence, and they realize that even if the courtroom eventually produces an answer, the town will still have to live with what this case revealed about itself. That night, the local news repeats the same lines again. Minnesota, 2000, cold case solved, arrest shocks community. The phrase solved sounds confident on television, but in living rooms across the town, confidence doesn't come. What comes is a different feeling, an uneasy awareness that justice is not a switch you flip. It is a long corridor you walk down, and every step echoes. People lie awake hearing those echoes, hearing the past moving, hearing the future approaching, and realizing that the most chilling part of a cold case isn't the mystery itself. It's the moment the mystery starts to thaw, because thawing doesn't just reveal answers. It reveals what the ice has been hiding, and it forces everyone to look. The closer the case creeps toward its deciding moment, the more the town begins to feel like it's living under a microscope. Every conversation sharpened, every familiar face suddenly carrying the possibility of a hidden past, and even the winter air outside the courthouse seems to bite a little harder, as if Minnesota itself is reminding everyone that nothing about this story will ever be warm or easy. People have stopped asking whether they'll hear the truth, and started asking what the truth will do to them once they finally have it. That's the part no one warns you about. You think answers will soothe you. You imagine closure like a door clicking shut. But a cold case doesn't close like that. It cracks open, and what spills out is not just facts, but consequences. Inside, the prosecution knows the jury is tired. Everyone is tired. Exhaustion is dangerous, because exhaustion makes people reach for simplicity, and simplicity is where both sides can win or lose. So the prosecution does something calculated. They stop adding new pieces and start tightening the ones already on the board, making the story feel less like a collection of fragments and more like a single, relentless line, running from the victim's last normal morning in 2000 to the knock on a door in the present, to the shockwave that followed. They want the jury to feel inevitability without saying the word. They want the jurors to look at the case and think, it could not have happened any other way. They revisit the timeline again. But this time it isn't just numbers and times, it's the shape of the day, the rhythm of the victim's life, the way routine can be so predictable that any deviation is like a siren. They remind the court that the victim was not someone who vanished casually, not someone known for disappearing, not someone who would leave without telling anyone. They emphasize the quiet, sharp fact that the victim's patterns stopped abruptly, like a radio signal cut mid-song. They bring up the last confirmed contacts, the last known location, the last small confirmations that anchor the person in the world before the world loses them. Then the defense counters, not with an alternative story that makes more sense, but with the same persistent pressure on uncertainty. They talk about what can't be known. They talk about the absence of a direct witness to a crime. They talk about the dangers of building certainty on inference. They point out that routine is not proof, that people do unexpected things, that assumptions can masquerade as logic. Their voice is steady, their posture composed, and they don't have to win hearts, only minds. They only have to create a gap. But the prosecution is ready for gaps. They fill them with consistency. They return again to the scientific evidence, not as a miracle, but as a quiet, stubborn voice that doesn't change its story no matter how many times it is questioned. They call the expert again, not because the jury needs more science, but because repetition is its own form of reinforcement. The expert explains, again, the safeguards, the cross-checks, the multiple layers of verification, The reason this result didn't appear in 2000 and why it appears now with the weight of modern interpretation. They keep the language clear. They avoid jargon. They let the certainty sit in the room like something solid. The defense tries to scratch at that solidity, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, like tapping a wall to find a hollow spot. Could the sample have been compromised? Could transfer explain it? Could the match be misread? They don't accuse directly. They imply. They don't need a scandal. They need a shadow. And for a moment, you can feel the shadow flicker, because in a cold case, people are trained by time to distrust easy answers. Then comes a witness the town has been waiting for, not because this person is famous, but because they are connective tissue, someone whose testimony doesn't feel like a distant expert report, but like the living memory of the community. The witness speaks about the suspect's presence in the victim's orbit, not as rumor but as fact, describing overlap, proximity, casual contact that once seemed harmless. The words are simple, and that simplicity is what makes the room go cold. It's one thing to imagine a predator hiding in darkness. It's another to imagine someone you recognized, someone whose name you might have said out loud without fear. The defense tries to cut the connection down to size. They ask about the nature of contact. They ask whether it was truly meaningful or simply incidental. They ask whether this witness could be influenced by what they now know. The witness holds steady, and that steadiness matters, because juries watch confidence like it's evidence, even though it shouldn't be. The judge reminds them, in sterile language, how to weigh testimony. But humans are not sterile. Humans are emotional creatures pretending to be rational. During a recess, the family steps into the hallway, and the hallway feels like a different world, a place where the rules loosen just enough for real life to seep through. You can see the toll on their faces, the years stacked behind their eyes, the way every new detail is both a gift and a blade. People glance at them and then look away, as if eye contact would be an intrusion, as if witnessing grief too closely might implicate you in it. Someone whispers, "I can't believe it." Someone else whispers, "What if they're wrong?" And the family hears it all, because grief makes you hyper-aware. Grief makes every sound louder, every doubt sharper, even when the doubt isn't aimed at you. Back in court, the prosecution introduces something that feels almost too ordinary to matter, which is exactly why it matters: behavior after the disappearance. Not violence, not dramatic confession, but an adjustment in life that aligns with someone carrying knowledge they shouldn't have. The prosecutor doesn't say it outright. They don't have to. They present the pattern as a series of documented moments. A change, a move, a shift in routine, choices that might mean nothing in isolation but start to look different when placed beside the timeline of the victim's absence. The jury watches, and you can see them doing that quiet human thing, fitting behavior into meaning, even when the court warns them not to do it too freely. The defense pushes back hard. They argue that people change for countless reasons, that interpreting behavior is speculative, that the prosecution is asking the jury to read minds. They remind everyone of the danger of hindsight, the way any ordinary decision can be painted as suspicious once the story has a suspect. They say the word prejudice without raising their voice, and the word lands anyway. They imply that the town's hunger for closure is pressing on the scales. And this is where the case reveals its real nature. It isn't just a battle over evidence. It's a battle over what the community needs to believe to survive. If the suspect is guilty, then the town must accept that evil lived among them unnoticed. If the suspect is not guilty, then the town must accept that it may never know what happened, even after all these years, even after all this attention, even after an arrest that felt like an ending. Either way, the town loses something. Either way, the myth of safety is gone. As the day drags on, tension shifts from the loud to the quiet. The loud moments, the objections, the cross-examinations start to feel like theater, while the quiet moments start to feel like truth. A juror rubbing their temple. A witness swallowing hard before answering. The family's hands clasped tight enough to turn knuckles pale. The suspect sitting still, expression controlled, a presence that feels almost unreal, like a symbol more than a person. People in the gallery stare at the back of the suspect's head as if they can force an explanation out of it. But explanations do not leak out of silence. Silence only grows. By late afternoon, the judge calls for final motions on a procedural matter, and the room stiffens again, because procedure is where cases can break. A ruling can exclude a piece of evidence, can reshape what the jury is allowed to consider. The lawyers speak in precise language, and the judge listens with a face like stone. The outcome is measured, not dramatic, but it matters. The path forward remains intact. The prosecution's structure holds. The defense's strategy remains possible, but narrower. The case continues to advance toward its moment of reckoning. Outside, snow threatens but doesn't fall, the sky a hard gray that looks like it's been scraped clean of color. People leave the courthouse in clusters, talking faster now, voices more urgent. Someone says, they've got him. Someone else says, not enough. Another person says, how could we not see it? And those words, how could we not see it, become the unofficial headline of the day, because that is the real shock of an arrest in a decades-old case. It doesn't just accuse one person. It accuses the entire illusion everyone lived inside. That night, local news broadcasts again, packaging the day into minutes, turning a courtroom's slow grind into a sequence of dramatic beats. Minnesota 2000 cold case solved. The anchor repeats, and the words feel like an incantation, like saying them often enough might make them true in the only way the public understands. Final, undeniable, over. But in homes across the town, people sit in silence, staring at screens, feeling the gap between solved and settled. Solved is a word for a headline. Settled is a word for a soul. The family sits with that gap like it's a physical object in the room, heavy, immovable. They have waited so long for the world to care again, and now that it does, they realize caring is noisy. Caring comes with strangers' opinions, with speculation, with doubt that can feel insulting even when it's legally necessary. They hold on to one thing because it is all they can hold. The idea that their loved one did not vanish into nothing, that the absence was not meaningless, that the truth, whatever shape it takes, exists. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, the town begins to understand that tomorrow will not be easier. Tomorrow will bring more testimony, more pressure, more careful words, more attempts to bend the past into something a jury can carry. Tomorrow will bring the continued thaw of a frozen story, and with every inch of ice that melts, the water underneath rises, cold and unavoidable, soaking into everything, reminding Minnesota that you can't resurrect the year 2000 without letting it haunt you all over again. By the time the case reaches closing arguments, the town has stopped pretending it's just watching history unfold and started realizing it is watching itself being rewritten in real time. Because a cold case doesn't simply return to the surface, it drags everything up with it. Old loyalties, old suspicions, old conversations that never felt important until now. And the courthouse becomes the center of gravity for a community that can't decide whether it wants the truth or whether it only wants relief from uncertainty. The morning air outside is sharp enough to sting, and people step through the doors with that same tight expression they've worn for weeks, a face that says, I'm here, but I don't want to be here, because being here means admitting this nightmare is real, and it belongs to us. Inside, the jury looks different now, not physically, but in posture, in attention, in the way their eyes move when exhibits are mentioned, the way their pens hover over notepads like they're afraid to miss the sentence that finally makes everything click. They have been living in 2000 for days, pulled backward by testimony and records and careful arguments, and now they sit at the edge of a decision that will follow them long after they leave this room. The judge's voice is calm, procedural, steady, but even steady voices can't flatten the tension in the air. The prosecution rises first, and you can feel the temperature shift the way you feel it when a storm is about to break. The prosecutor does not begin with anger. They begin with certainty, measured and controlled, because certainty is what the town has been starving for, and they know it. They speak about time like it is not an obstacle, but a witness, a long witness that held its tongue until the tools existed to interpret what was preserved. They talk about how the case was never truly dead, only waiting. And as they say it, you can almost see the jurors trying to hold two realities at once. The reality where the truth was always there, and the reality where the truth took 25 years to become audible. The prosecutor reminds them of the victim as a person, not as a headline, not as a file number, but as a life with routines, with plans, with a future that stopped abruptly, and the room tightens around that fact, because it is the one thing no one can argue with. Someone vanished from their own life, and the world kept moving without them. Then the prosecutor starts walking the jury through the case the way you'd walk someone down a hallway with all the doors locked behind you. They return to the timeline, not to repeat, but to compress it into something undeniable. They point to the last confirmed moments of normalcy, the last anchors that placed the victim in the world, and then they show the silence that followed, the abrupt severing of pattern. They emphasize that this was not a wandering off, not a choice, not a casual disappearance, and they do it without dramatics because the absence itself is dramatic enough. They pivot to opportunity and connection, to how the suspect existed close enough to move within the victim's orbit without setting off alarms, close enough to be ordinary. And ordinary is exactly what makes a cold case so terrifying when it finally thaws. The answer doesn't arrive wearing a mask. It arrives wearing familiarity. The prosecutor's voice grows sharper when they talk about evidence. Not emotional sharpness, structural sharpness. They stack point upon point, corroborations, records, consistencies that survive time. They talk about how witnesses may forget exact words, but independent sources do not forget their own existence. They mention the scientific evidence again, carefully, with respect, because they know jurors can mistrust what they don't understand. They explain it like a bridge made of steel. You don't have to know how every bolt was forged to understand that the bridge holds weight. They argue that the DNA is not an opinion, not a mood, not a rumor. It is a result produced by methods designed to prevent guesswork from masquerading as truth. They remind the jury how the defense tried to paint shadows around it: contamination, transfer, possibility. And then they ask the jury to look at what was actually presented in court. Safeguards, chain of custody, verification, the absence of credible evidence of tampering, the consistency of the match. The prosecutor never says you must. They say consider. They say follow. They say look at what holds. And then, like the final turn of a screw, the prosecutor addresses the elephant in every cold case courtroom: the years. 25 years is a lifetime. People have changed, moved, died. Memories have been revised by time and by survival. The prosecutor acknowledges that, but they frame it as a test the evidence passed. Despite the years, the story remained consistent where it mattered. Despite the years, the preserved pieces aligned when technology finally gave them a voice. They argue that time did not create this case. Time only delayed its clarity. The prosecutor finishes with a statement that lands like a hammer, not because it is loud, but because it is simple. The community waited too long for answers, but the waiting does not erase what happened, and it does not erase who the evidence points to now. The defense stands, and the room shifts again, because the defense does not need to offer comfort. The defense needs to offer doubt. They begin by reminding the jury of the gravity of the decision, the finality of what a verdict means. They speak about the danger of hunger, the hunger to solve, the hunger to close, the hunger to label a case solved, because the human mind hates open endings. They talk about the romance of the cold case, the way the public loves a dramatic resolution, the way headlines can create momentum that the courtroom is expected to honor. They tell the jury, bluntly, that the courtroom must not be seduced by the town's need for an ending. They attack the timeline not by denying it exists, but by emphasizing what it cannot prove on its own. The defense points out that a timeline can show absence, can show opportunity, but opportunity is not the same thing as action. They remind the jury there is no direct witness who saw a crime occur, no definitive moment captured on camera, no confession offered in open court. They use the years like a blade, arguing that the gaps created by time are not a minor inconvenience, but a structural weakness. Witnesses may be sincere, they say, but sincerity is not accuracy. Memory is not a recording device. Memory is a reconstruction, and reconstruction is vulnerable to suggestion, repetition, headlines, community pressure. Then they go after the scientific evidence with a different tone than before, not technical, but philosophical. They tell the jury that science is powerful, but it is not a fairy tale ending. Science does not automatically equal guilt. They remind the jury that DNA can indicate contact, presence, proximity, but it does not narrate intent, does not explain context, does not draw the complete map of events. They bring back the language of possibility again, not to prove that possibility happened, but to emphasize that possibility exists, and where possibility exists, reasonable doubt can live. They talk about contamination not as accusation, but as a principle. Humans handle evidence. Humans store evidence. Humans interpret evidence. Humans make mistakes. The defense does not need to show a mistake occurred. They need to show that the system is capable of mistakes, and that capability is enough to demand caution. The defense returns to the investigation itself, pointing to the early days, the paths explored, the leads that went nowhere, the choices made when the case was fresh and confusion was high. They suggest that the investigation of today may have been guided by the desire to solve the unsolved, to redeem a file that haunted a department, to produce closure for a community that had carried fear for too long. They warn the jury about confirmation bias, about the human tendency to interpret ambiguous facts through the lens of a chosen conclusion. They say the prosecution's structure looks strong because it has been built with the suspect already framed as the answer. They ask the jury to imagine the same evidence presented with another name on the defendant's chair. Would it still feel inevitable? Would it still feel like certainty? Or would it feel like what it is? A case built on inference, assembled from fragments, sharpened by time into something that might look like truth, but could still be wrong. The room sits in a heavy silence as both sides finish, because everyone knows this is the last time anyone will speak with full freedom before the jury disappears behind closed doors to decide what the community will carry forever. The judge instructs the jury in careful language about law, about burden, about presumption, about the meaning of reasonable doubt, and each instruction feels like a weight dropped onto a table. Then the jury stands, files out, and the courtroom exhales without realizing it has been holding its breath. Outside that jury room, time becomes a different kind of weapon. Minutes stretch, hours soften into something unreal. The family waits with eyes fixed on nothing. Investigators sit in stiff silence, replaying every moment of testimony, every exhibit, every cross-examination, wondering which line landed and which line slipped away. The suspect waits too, removed from the public's gaze, a person whose name has already become a symbol in the town's mind, whether the verdict agrees or not. Reporters hover like birds over still water, ready to dive on any movement, any whisper, any sign that a decision is nearing. The community waits in parallel. People refresh news feeds. They argue in living rooms. They stare at their phones like the screen might start speaking. Some are already convinced of guilt, already rehearsing relief, already imagining the first night they'll sleep without the cold case pressing on their thoughts. Others are nervous, wary, reminding themselves that a wrong verdict is not closure. It is another tragedy layered onto the first. The town is split not just by opinion, but by fear. Fear of convicting the wrong person, fear of letting the right person go, fear that even after all this, the truth might still refuse to be neatly contained. And in that waiting, a strange realization settles in, quiet but undeniable. The verdict will not erase the year 2000. It will not rewind time. It will not restore what was taken. It will only decide what the community must call reality from this point forward. That is the final cruelty of a cold case finally reaching the edge of resolution. You don't get the past back. You only get an answer, and sometimes the answer is not peace. Sometimes the answer is another weight to carry. The courthouse remains still, the jury room sealed, and the town hangs suspended between solved and proven, between headline certainty and legal finality, between what people want to believe and what 12 strangers must agree can be said out loud without flinching. Somewhere behind that closed door, voices are speaking in low tones, evidence is being weighed, doubt is being measured, and Minnesota's year 2000 is waiting, again, for the world to decide what it means. The verdict doesn't arrive with thunder. It arrives with the soft, procedural scrape of a chair, the shuffle of paper, the quiet signal from a bailiff that makes the entire courthouse snap into a single, shared heartbeat. People who have been pacing stop mid-step. Phones are lowered. Conversations die in the throat. Outside, cameras tilt forward as if they can physically pull the moment out of the building. Inside, the air tightens, and you can feel the years compress, 25 winters folding into one instant. Because this is what a cold case becomes at the end, less a story than a pressure point. less a mystery than a verdict-shaped void everyone has been circling for decades. The jury files in, faces neutral in the way people try to look neutral when they are carrying something heavy. No one can read them. No one should try. But everyone does anyway, because the human mind hates waiting without clues. The family sits so still it looks like discipline, but it's not discipline, it's survival. Their bodies have learned how to stay intact in rooms like this, where words can either release you or crush you. Investigators sit with hands folded, not praying, not exactly, but holding the smallest part of themselves that still believes the work mattered. The prosecution looks composed, the defense looks composed, and the suspect, quiet, controlled, contained, looks like a person who has been reduced to a single question: did you do it? The judge speaks, formalities, the kind of language built to keep emotion from infecting law, but emotion is already everywhere, woven into every breath. The clerk asks the foreperson a question that seems simple and yet contains an entire lifetime of consequences, and the foreperson answers with a voice that sounds steadier than anyone feels. A word, a decision, a sound that travels through the room like a shockwave. The family doesn't erupt. There is no cinematic release, no clean ending. There is only a visible shift, a subtle collapse of tension into something else, something heavier, something final, something that doesn't feel like celebration because no one here is getting back what was taken. If the verdict affirms guilt, it does not restore a life. If the verdict rejects it, it does not restore peace. It only chooses which kind of pain the town must now carry forward. For a second, the courthouse is silent in a way that feels unnatural, like even the building is waiting to learn how to exist after this. Then the world rushes back in. Pens move. Reporters' hands fly to phones. The judge continues speaking, instructions, next steps, words that sound like machinery, because the system never stops. The family hears almost none of it. They are listening to something else. The sound of a door closing after being held open for 25 years. The sound of a chapter that refused to end finally being forced into an ending. Outside, the headline is born before the family has even stood up. Minnesota 2000 cold case solved. Arrest shocks community. Verdict delivers justice. The words are fast, efficient, sharp-edged, because that's what headlines do. They carve life into a shape the public can consume. The cameras catch the courthouse steps like hunters waiting for movement. When the family appears, they are met with microphones, questions, the relentless appetite of an audience that wants the story to finish in a sentence. But the family's faces say what sentences cannot. They say that truth is not the same thing as relief. They say that closure is not a switch, it's a slow, complicated grief that changes form but does not disappear. Investigators speak next, carefully. They talk about perseverance, about never giving up, about the power of technology and determination. They mention evidence preserved, procedures followed, the importance of coming forward, the message they want the town to hear. That time can delay justice, but it doesn't have to erase it. Behind their measured words, you can feel something raw. For decades, this file sat like an accusation in a cabinet, a reminder that not every case ends with answers. Now it has an ending, and that ending is both victory and burden, because the ending proves something else too, that the truth can live beside you for years, hidden in plain sight, while you mow your lawn and wave at neighbors and pretend your town is too small for darkness. The defense, if they speak at all, speaks in the language of rights and process, the promise of appeals, the insistence that the story is not finished. The law rarely allows a story to end cleanly. Motions follow verdicts the way shadows follow bodies. And for the community, that legal uncertainty can feel like a new kind of torment, because they want finality the way thirsty people want water. They want one definitive statement that seals the past and keeps it there. But cold cases don't behave. Cold cases leave residue. Cold cases keep talking. The suspect is moved through corridors and doors most people never see, away from cameras, away from crowds, away from the town that now speaks their name like it's a warning. There is no dramatic confession, no sudden outburst that satisfies the public's hunger for a villain who looks like a villain. If anything, the absence of spectacle makes it worse. Because the town wants a moment they can point to and say, that's when everything made sense. But nothing makes sense. Not fully. Not when you've lived with unanswered questions for so long that answers feel foreign. And then, in the hours and days that follow, the real shock arrives. Not the arrest, not the verdict, but the aftertaste of knowing. People return to their routines because they have to. Children go to school. Shops open. Snow keeps falling the way it always does. But the town is not the same town. It has a new map now, an invisible one, marked with locations that carry weight. A street where someone once felt safe now feels watched by memory. A familiar building becomes a symbol. A casual intersection becomes a place where the past still feels present. Conversations change. Some people speak with anger. How could this happen here? How could we not see it? How could we have shared sidewalks with someone capable of this? Others speak with fear. If this could hide among us, what else can hide? Some speak with defensiveness, pushing back against the narrative that the town was blind, insisting that no one could have known. And beneath every argument, there is the same uneasy truth. Hindsight is brutal. It turns ordinary memories into evidence and leaves you wondering what you missed. The family begins the strange process of living after resolution. That sounds like relief to outsiders, but inside, it's complicated. For years, grief had a shape. The shape of uncertainty, the shape of unanswered calls, the shape of a chair that stayed empty because you couldn't fully accept it would always be empty. Now grief changes shape. Now it becomes grief with a name attached, grief with an outcome, grief that must coexist with the fact that the world expects you to move on. People say, at least you have answers. They mean well. But answers don't refill the space at the table. Answers don't rewind birthdays and holidays and quiet evenings that should have been ordinary, but became haunted. Answers simply end one kind of suffering and begin another, the suffering of knowing. The case becomes a reference point, a story told to newcomers, a warning wrapped in local history. People will say, remember the Minnesota 2000 cold case, the way they say, remember the winter the river froze early, as if tragedy is just another season. Documentaries will follow. Podcasts will call. YouTube thumbnails will scream, solved in bold letters. And the town will watch its pain become content, packaged and replayed, because that's what happens when a mystery finally breaks open in the modern world. The story escapes its origin and becomes something else, something larger, something that belongs to strangers. Yet the most unsettling part is quieter. It is the way ordinary life now carries a faint distortion, like a photograph taken through glass. People look at neighbors and wonder what they don't know. They look at their own memories and question their accuracy. They look at the year 2000 and realize it was never safely in the past. It was always waiting. The cold case didn't just freeze. It fermented, changing the town slowly, invisibly, until one day it detonated in the present. And even with a verdict, even with an official conclusion, the case leaves behind questions that don't fit neatly into court documents. Why that day? Why that person? Why in a town that thought it was immune? The law does not require those answers, and the system rarely provides them. The community, though, still asks, because communities need narratives the way individuals need oxygen. They need to believe in cause and effect, in warning signs, in a world where tragedy can be anticipated and therefore prevented. But the real lesson of a cold case is not comforting. The lesson is that evil often arrives quietly, and the absence of warning is not proof of safety. On the night the verdict becomes official history, the town is quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just quiet. Porch lights glow against the cold, and somewhere a television murmurs with late-night coverage, anchors repeating the same lines, the same headline language, the same confident phrasing. Solved, closed, justice. But in the houses behind those porch lights, people lie awake, staring at ceilings, thinking about how the story began, thinking about the victim's last normal day, thinking about how a quarter century can pass and still feel like yesterday when the past finally speaks. The case is solved, yes, in the language of headlines, in the language of courtrooms, in the language of systems built to put endings on chaos. But the community's truth is messier. The community's truth is that something happened here that will always leave an imprint. The family's truth is that resolution is not resurrection. The investigator's truth is that time can be beaten, but never without cost. And Minnesota's truth, quiet, cold, unavoidable, is that the year 2000 is no longer just a memory. It is a scar, reopened and resealed, A reminder that even when a cold case is finally brought into the light, the shadows it cast can linger for a lifetime.